Welcome to the Association's Futures Podcast, brought to you by Association Activision. We ask you to join us to discuss the future of the Association's community. How can we build and focus on the many futures we will see during these disruptive times? Let's get started with today's guest.
Welcome to the Association Futures Podcast, where we explore how associations can move beyond what has already been and start shaping what's next. I'm your host, Michael Butera. Today, we're stepping into a conversation that sits right at the center of the association value proposition, and yet, in many organizations, remains underleveraged: education. Most associations would say they have it: a conference, a series of webinars, a library resources, and technically, of course, that's true. But the model treats education as programming. What if we treated it as infrastructure? Because associations don't just create content, they sit at the intersection of expertise, community, and real-world practice. Every day, their members are solving problems, testing ideas, and advancing their profession. The real opportunity is not delivering more programs. It's turning that expertise into something scalable, something continuous, something that builds workforce capability while also driving growth. That's exactly where today's guest has been focusing her work. Welcome, Dr. Kathy Lada, CAE, AAiP. She operates at the intersection of marketing, learning, technology, and growth. She has more than 15 years in marketing and audience development and leadership expertise designing education portfolios and professional development ecosystems. She brings a perspective that is still too rare in the association space, because most learning leaders come from instructional design. Most marketing leaders focused on demand generation. But Kathy brings both. Her work is about connecting those disciplines, taking that expertise already inside the association and turning it into structured, scalable learning products that are not only well designed, but also widely adopted, strategically positioned, and financially sustainable. She has led enterprise marketing and demand generation strategies, built integrated education portfolios tied to certification and workforce needs, and helping organizations treat learning not just as a member benefit, but as a growth engine. And the results speak for themselves, driving significant increases in engagement, registrations, and membership through education-centered strategy. In today's conversation, we're going to explore what it really means to move from programs to ecosystems, from content to capability, from activity to impact. Kathy, welcome to the Association Futures Podcast.
Fantastic, Michael. Thank you so much for that lovely introduction and all the background information, and for having me as a guest on your podcast. I've seen quite a few of the episodes, and I'm just thrilled that you would even think to invite me on. So thank you for that.
Well, the pleasure is all mine. I think this is such an important subject that we're going to deal with today. So, Kathy, let's start at the foundation. When you say learning ecosystem, what do you mean in practical terms, and how is that different from what most associations are doing today?
Sure, that's a great question to start out. Let me start with this. I once heard someone describe association education as a conference, a couple webinars, maybe a resource library, and technically that's true. But I think that description misses the real opportunity. As you mentioned in your intro, associations do sit at the center of an extraordinary amount of expertise. Every day, members are solving problems, testing ideas, figuring out what works in their organizations, but most of that knowledge never scales. It stays with the individuals, companies, or teams. So a learning ecosystem is what happens when an association captures that expertise and turns it into something bigger. So instead of isolated programs, you're going to create a system where professionals learn continuously from the field and from each other. And when that happens, the association becomes more than an event organizer. I think it becomes the place where the profession learns how to move forward. A learning ecosystem is what connects conferences and webinars, certificate programs, certification programs, job aids, articles, you name it. You know, there's a lot of really great content in associations, but it connects all of those things into a continuous career pathway instead of just isolated learning events. It actually strengthens individual careers as well as elevating an entire profession when you keep that perspective in mind. So it's kind of not just a list of topics that we're going to cover at my association. It's the structure behind what people need to learn, in what order and why, so that they can build knowledge and skills over time. So instead of asking what course should we build or what webinar and in order, what webinar topic should we offer next week or next month, associations are asking what learning pathway will help professionals develop real capability.
Well, thanks for bringing that kind of overall understanding of what we mean when we say ecosystem. You
Yeah.
used the idea that many associations already have in the pieces. They've
Mm-hmm.
just haven't connected them. What are those pieces and what's typically missing?
Yeah. So when you look at a learning ecosystem, there's so many ways that you could really put one together. Basically what it boils down to in one regard is that the same expertise can support members at different moments of need in their careers for a specific topic of learning. And so it could be something that a conference session might introduce a concept or an emerging issue. A webinar or masterclass then would explore that topic in more depth. A certificate program would then build real capacity around that specific skill area. And then micro learnings or job aids could help professionals apply that idea in their day-to-day work. And then finally, communities and peer discussions to reinforce that learning through shared experience. So I think what's missing in associations is that structure behind what I just outlined, because that just doesn't obviously happen by accident. You need to plan for it, and you need to understand your members' needs and your depending on your focus. If you're focusing on workforce as well as your members, so you really need to understand those pieces of it and how to put those together.
Thanks again for the answer. And I kind of love the analogy of a zoo versus a natural ecosystem. So,
Mhm.
with that in mind, can you expand on that a bit and what changes when learning becomes interconnected rather than isolated?
Sure. To kind of bring the concept that I just talked about to life about what an ecosystem model would look like with associations as the background, let's consider a zoo versus the natural ecosystem. A zoo has animals, as does the natural ecosystem, but in a zoo, they are separated into cages. And a well-stocked zoo will have lots of different types of animals, just like a typical association has lots of types of content and education that are siloed. So they're in their own little cages. In a natural ecosystem, the animals have relationships and interactions with each other, and they're situated in a particular context or environment. And learning ecosystems work the same way. Programs should not live in separate cages, they should reinforce each other.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of looking at this. And the next few questions I have, one, I want to explore the strategic relevance of why this matters so much. So, why is this shift from programs to ecosystems
Mhm.
becoming more urgent at this point in time for associations?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think this shift has been coming for a while. And I think I would give you three reasons why. I think, and I'll expand on each one, the skills shifting that is needed. The real competitive asset for associations is really not events, it's expertise. And then this kind of program outperforms isolated events in education. So going back to the skill shifts, I was doing some research on this the other day. I'm writing a blog post series on this topic as well. But according to the World Economic Forum, nearly 44% of worker skills will need to change in just 1 year due to technology and industry shifts. And I know you've seen it too, Michael. We talked about that before, about all these shifting needs and how fast everything is changing with AI. I would say that associations today are operating in a knowledge economy where the real asset, as I mentioned, is not events, but it's the expertise. So to me, the association's role is to capture it, organize it, distribute it, and apply it so that education becomes a delivery system for professional knowledge. And so that is the competitive advantage. And then these things outperform isolated programs. When I was at my last association, I purposefully designed an education strategy so that we had the framework for the design and delivery, not just for individual career growth or even organizational growth, but growth for the field.
Well, having said that, you've said that education is really a delivery system for a profession's knowledge. That's a powerful idea. How should association leaders think differently if they truly embrace that idea?
Yeah, I think it is sort of a revolutionary kind of idea, although I have to say that many associations that I've talked to do have pieces of the ecosystem in place. They just haven't necessarily connected all the dots. But I think that associations basically have three superpowers: convening power, extraordinary content because they co-create sometimes with their members, but they have that input directly from the field that they serve, and community. So we can use this as a delivery system for not only the professional's knowledge, the individual career growth, but for the whole profession's knowledge. Some associations already do this, generally the ones who would offer a certification or accreditation program. So thinking differently means embracing that ambiguity and change, and sometimes even our competitors. All of our superpowers are being eroded in this environment because of competition and because of private equity buying out a lot of our members. Like my last association was the healthcare association, and they didn't really believe in participating in the learning ecosystem. So that was a challenge in and of itself. But yeah, we need to view partnerships differently. We can and should reach out to all stakeholders to understand and design and develop an ecosystem, even with our competitors. I was just on a webinar panel I was telling you before we started here yesterday, talking about this, and associations are already doing this in many fields such as healthcare, where the stakes are very, very high.
So, what are the risks if associations don't make this shift? What do they lose over time?
Well, I think it goes back to what I would say, and others might have other thoughts as well that I'm open to, but I think we're already seeing some of the effects of this erosion of our convening power, content, and community. We're seeing sometimes declining membership growth and retention, declining event registration because your members and non-members, prospects, are not seeing the value that you add. They're just seeing isolated programs and not something that's really going to help them with their career to move forward over time. I think that when that happens enough over time, the association loses brand equity, and brand equity is just that extra special value that people feel that your brand has because they know it and they trust it and they think well of it. It's why someone picks Nike over a plain sneaker, or Coke over a no-name soda. The product might be similar, but the brand already means something in their mind, like quality, trust, or status. And I think that if we don't make this shift, I think associations risk the chance of becoming more and more irrelevant to their membership base and their profession that they serve, as well as a whole.
Let's talk a little bit about converting from theory to practice.
Yeah.
So, when you stepped into your role at AAOE,
Mm-hmm.
what did education look like, and what made you realize it needed to evolve?
Sure. So it looked like a series of siloed education and events. Nothing was connected. The event calendar even was a little sparse. It is a small staff association, so that has something to do with it as well. There's only so many resources there. But I began doing some research in my marketing role into who was participating in the conferences and webinars, for example. And what I found is that we were delivering value to a pretty small section of the membership. So it was very much a challenge to position the education, offer the right education. And I'll have some more on segmentation and things later that I'd like to address too. But that's really, when I stepped into that role, that's really what education looked like. And as the Chief Marketing and Membership Officer, it was my role to really understand the market and what products we had and how they were serving our members. So that's how this whole education learning ecosystem fits into marketing and membership development.
So, listening to you provide that information there, I seem to see that you've reframed the question from what programs should we offer to what capabilities do professional needs. That's a fundamental shift. And how did that change your strategy?
Yeah, it's definitely a mindset shift. And that's actually honestly one that I hadn't started yet before I left AAoE. We had budgeted for some external expertise to help us conduct an environmental scan of our members' environments and help us conduct some modified versions of training needs assessment so that we can understand the ecosystem better and the stakeholder roles in that ecosystem. And I think that when you co-create something like a learning ecosystem with all your stakeholders, you have a much stronger product and a much fuller product. So we would have had to change our strategy for working with our competitors, allied organizations, vendors, and frankly, our members.
Yeah, in earlier conversations as we prepared for today, you also mentioned that you segmented the audience in a more intentional way. What did
Mm-hmm.
you learn about how different roles engage with learning?
Yeah, so when I was starting to do my market research to craft some marketing personas to understand better our members' needs and pain points, I found some things that disagreed or conflicted with the education that we were putting out there. So, for instance, my research showed that the vast majority of our members had about 10 years or more of experience in orthopedic management, yet most of the education was at a beginner or introductory level. About 30% of the members were in the C-suite, yet there wasn't really much content for them, succession planning and leadership and foresight and all these things. And about 17% of our members had 5 or fewer years of experience in orthopedic management. But again, they had more content than the other groups that I described, but they still needed that career pathway. That was the missing thing in all of the education that we were offering, was just what is the pathway to get from learning about a concept that you should understand to do your job, but then learning about it, doing a deep dive into it, getting that learning reinforced with job aids or other knowledge transfer tools for the workplace, and then the measurement and management of that. So that was what I took away from the research that I did on segmentation of the audience. We actually were able to create those personas that I mentioned. We end up creating 4 personas, and we're able to really structure our education more around the career pathways for those 4 groups instead
One
of
of
just
the
the one.
I'm sorry. One of the things that I like about the conversation we're having is how you integrate data and research into the human element of how we operate in the association world. And in terms of the work that you were doing there, one of the most interesting parts of that work is how you connected learning formats, conferences, webinars, tools, and peer learning. So, what did that integration actually look like in practice?
Yeah, that's a great question because it was a small association, and it was already a matrixed organization when I came on board, which was great, meaning that all the different departments would collaborate with one another and work on projects, and the people on those projects would sort of ebb and flow. When I was there and connecting these learning formats, like you mentioned, the conferences and the webinars, et cetera, I was able to create a framework for doing that based on one of our online courses that they had developed before I got there, called the Orthopedic Practice Management Fundamentals course. And I used that body of knowledge And then from there, it was a matter of creating a grid. You're going to find I love spreadsheets, and I find them to be very helpful tools. But I created a grid of the education offered, and then I was going to prepare the Education Council, which was a group of volunteers focused on education, and the Annual Conference Council, to review each course, webinar, conference session, and resource, and then classify them. So we did all of the pre-work to get to that stage and had a scheduled time actually for after the annual conference to pick the project back up. The annual conference is actually taking place this weekend and into next week. So we didn't quite get to the implementation part, but if we had, we would have developed a synopsis document of the 4 member personas created. And what I discussed with the volunteer managers and the staff there was understanding the needs and pain points of those different 4 personas, the strengths and gaps of our current education offerings, because they were the members had the expertise to see where the gaps were and what the strengths were. So we would have co-created a strategic plan to truly address the need. I created a strategic plan, introductory strategic plan, if you will, based on what I knew. And the next step was to take it to the volunteers to make sure that it was grounded in member needs.
Yeah, well, one of the highlights that I noticed was something you introduced called enhanced education experiences. Why is
Yeah.
it so important to move beyond just recordings to tools like job aids and implementation guides, as you were mentioning?
Yeah, it's incredibly important. It actually can literally cost billions of dollars. And I'm speaking from one of my really early career moves when I was at the National Electrical Manufacturers Association back in the early 2000s. And the big dig was happening in Boston at the time, and they were using NEMA standards, NEMA being the organization that I worked for. And NEMA actually produced implementation guides for their standards, but they tended to be ignored to a great deal, mostly because it was really hard to find them on the website, and they weren't just automatically sent when a customer would buy a standard. So that literally cost billions of dollars in lost revenue, in actual cash outlays with ruined product as they tried to build a big dig. So it is incredibly important to go beyond just recordings and live sessions to have job aids and implementation guides. And that's where we come back to our learning ecosystem model, because in the same expertise can support members at different moments of needs. And as I mentioned, like a conference session could introduce a concept or emerging issue, a webinar or master class goes in more depth, all the way through the reinforcing the learning through shared experience. So it is incredibly important to do that, even when the stakes are maybe not as high as $1 billion project gone awry.
Yeah. So for association leaders listening to us, this
Mhm.
could sound like a pretty big lift.
Sure.
Yeah, where should they realistically start?
Yeah, no, it absolutely can be a big lift, and you need to take it at your own pace. It depends on what resources you have, but I would say a medium to larger association could probably do this in from 3 to 4 months, so 12 to 16 weeks. So you could do this, and I would recommend starting the way that I did. Analyze your current membership base and your prospect base too, if you have that information of non-members, and understand your demographics and geographics. I created focus groups of members to discuss their needs and pain points, and then organized the segments that I found during my initial analysis. And then I took that input and used ChatGPT. You got to have that AI in there, right? To analyze the non-attributed notes, so anonymized notes from those focus groups, to create those personas. We validated them and then mapped out the learning path and instructional design to what we currently offer. So that would be the full process, which probably does sound daunting. And that's probably why we didn't quite get to full implementation at my last association. It was stretched out over time. And as I said, the conference is this weekend, so the work couldn't get done. But if that sounds still daunting, I would start by addressing just one segment of the learning ecosystem, that knowledge transfer to the workplace that we were just talking about with my big dig example. That's in fact where we started in my last association. And not to get into the weeds, but you just purchase an infographic creator like Bengage or Napkin. We trained staff on how to use them. We used our favorite LLM, Claude, to analyze the content, the PowerPoints and recordings from webinars and conference sessions, and then generated the job aids and infographics. So that would probably be the easiest place to start. And it would give you like one insight into your members as to how they use the knowledge that you're providing to them.
You've emphasized starting with capabilities instead of programs. So, what's a simple way for an association to begin to identify those capabilities?
Yeah, so definitely start with your marketing / education personas. Those are going to provide the needs and pain points that you can focus on, highlighting those capabilities that members must have to do their jobs well. And those can be things from the so-called soft skills. I hate that phrase because I think they're so important, and I think soft skills negate some of that value. But soft skills like providing excellent customer service by actively listening and diffusing tense situations, as well as the hard skills like project management. So that's probably where I would start.
So, one of the other things you bring to this conversations is what I would call a marketing lens. So, what role does marketing play in guiding members through a learning ecosystem?
Oh my gosh, it's huge because what we're talking about, if you implement a learning ecosystem, is a full transformation of offering these isolated single events, webinars, or even conferences, podcasts, blog posts into this whole ecosystem. And that's a big shift for not only associations, but their members who are not accustomed to coming to you for like full out career help for how do I get from where I am, me specifically, not Joe Blow down the street, but how do I get from where I am to be running this organization that I'm currently a manager at. At my last association, we piloted those job aids and summaries as enhanced education. We had to come up with something, and job aids is a very industry design specific jargon, so that really didn't convey the meaning of how valuable those things were. But we found out that we didn't have such a great system in place for publicizing their availability or making them available in what I would call a friction-free environment. You had to learn into the LMS, you had to like scroll to the right course, then you had to go to the downloads. And I mean, it was things that we found out during the pilot phase, luckily, that were just like, oh, we need to step back and we need to focus these things. And that can be a marketing job to do. I have a background in UX design, so I was able to work with our members and really try to smooth over that to some degree. But really, without the proper positioning and marketing of what's changed and what hasn't, you're not going to get the impact that you're seeking. So I would say marketing is absolutely critical to the whole process here.
So let's talk a little bit about positioning this internally inside the organization. How do you move from education initiative to something boards actually see as strategic?
Yeah, I think it starts by reframing the conversation. It's not just about offering more education. It's about helping the profession build the capabilities it needs to stay strong and relevant. And when you position learning that way to improve workforce readiness, member value, industry leadership, boards are much more likely to see it as a strategic investment instead of just another program area that they're being asked to spend money on. That shifts the conversation from what webinars are we offering to what problems are we helping the profession solve. And I found that that was the way to get the interest in the buy-in from the board to understand what it was that we were striving for.
Just to follow up a little bit, so what are the strongest arguments for a learning ecosystem when you're talking to the board or a senior leadership team?
Yeah, so the strongest argument is that most associations are already sitting on a huge amount of expertise, but too much of it is trapped in very disconnected formats. That's where the learning ecosystem helps turn that expertise into something more scalable, more useful, and more visible across the profession by connecting those conferences and certificates and things. It's really about moving from that isolated educational activity to a knowledge infrastructure that builds workforce capability. And we're talking a little bit about workforce development, and I really didn't define it yet. My apologies. Workforce development is how the profession builds the people and capabilities it needs to thrive. At the individual level, it focuses on careers. At the field level, it focuses on making sure that the profession itself has the talents, the capabilities, and the standards that they need to meet demand. So for associations, that includes all of the things that we do education-wise. There's actually 3 really good examples that I would share that you could take a look at to see a learning ecosystem in reality. One of them is at eachmoment.com. It is run by the American Association of Teaching Athletic Trainers. The NGMA, the National Grants Management Association, is a small staff association as well, but they also have a Build Your Career section on their site. And then lastly, the Association of Training and Development has an excellent pathway section. So what I would do if you're trying to persuade your board or senior leadership that this is a worthwhile thing to do, I would absolutely show them examples that have already been successful so that they don't feel like they're out on a limb with some new concept that hasn't been proven. It absolutely has been, and you can share these examples with them to make your point.
Well, thank you for those examples. Just one last question in this section, and that's how does this connect to things associations care deeply about? Membership growth,
Oh, that.
engagement, not oh that, yeah, engagement, non-dues revenue, those kinds of things.
Right. Because learning ecosystems create a lot more value and it lasts longer than a single event or webinar or conference session. It gives members more reasons to stay engaged because it helps them grow over time. And that's where the marketing comes in. You have to tell them what you're doing for them, and do that often. You need to help show that it's solving real problems at their work, which will happen if you have those job aids and knowledge transfers, and then the support they need through peer groups to make the changes that are necessary in their performance. At the same time, it opens the doors to stronger non-dues revenue through certificates and toolkits, cohort programs, and other learning products. It could be in the form of vendor support for that. I know that at my last association, we had a lot more interest once we created these learning ecosystem light, kind of like our pilot product. That was much more interesting to vendors because they saw that there was a growth goal in there for that, and it was a much more powerful value proposition than saying, oh, we have 10 webinars on this topic or 12 webinars on this topic. We could actually demonstrate that we're providing impact in there. So non-dues revenue, and just by being more intentional about creating these ecosystems, they can serve the profession better and build a more sustainable business model at the same time.
Those are excellent points. And on the future-oriented side of this conversation, if associations fully embrace this model, how does their role in the profession change?
Well, I think their role gets much bigger. I think they move from being primarily a program provider or event organizer to becoming real capability builders for their profession, and that will get out there. Instead of just delivering information, they help people build skills and apply the knowledge, grow over time, which makes the association more central to the future of the industry, not just a supporter of it.
So, what becomes possible for an association that truly operates as a learning ecosystem that isn't possible today?
I think what becomes possible is a much more continuous and strategic kind of value. I think that when the association can connect conferences and webinars, job aids, certificates, and peer learning into a real pathway that supports professionals at different stages of their careers and different moments of need, that means that there's stronger relevance to the member, there's more influence on workforce capability, and more opportunities to turn expertise into scalable products and services and revenue streams instead of relying so heavily on one-time experiences. I don't think that as associations we can afford to continue to produce like a single webinar or a single conference session with a subject matter expert and just leave it there. If we can create other tools out of it, like the job aids, executive summaries, micro learning options, just different formats, and that extends the value of that education session just dozens of times. And we just can't afford to have these one-off sessions and not maximize their value.
What a great point. Kathy, before we close, first, I want to thank you for taking
Okay.
time out of your schedule to help us educate our audience about the learning ecosystem. And
Sure.
if people in our audience want to reach out to you, tell them the best way that they can find you.
Yeah, I'd love to have conversations with any of your listeners here. And the best way to reach me is in my heading here on my Zoom background. It's cathylada.com, CATHYLADA.com. And my email address is on there. You can book time with me. I'm going to have my blog post series on this topic going up shortly. I've got a whole sorts of other resources up there as well now.
Well, Kathy, once again, I want to thank you for sharing your valuable time with us today. As we've had this conversation, one of the things that stands out to me in this conversation is that associations don't really have an expertise problem. They have a systems problem. The knowledge is already there. The opportunity is connecting it, scaling it, and turning it into something that moves the profession forward. So thank you for helping us think differently about that.
Thank
Friends,
you for having me.
oh, my pleasure, believe me. Friends, this is your host, Michael Butera, reminding you to think for the future yet to come. See you on our next podcast when once again we will explore what comes next. Have a great day.